We have already learned how to define methods, how to call them, how they can receive values, how they can return values. We have also taken a look at how these have access modifiers. During this lecture, we're going to talk about variables and scope. A variable is a representation of a value. So a certain value can be represented by a variable. Let's start using variables by changing our code a little bit. We're going to change what the add method does. And as we do it, we're going to take a look at how a method can actually not return anything, just like the main method does. So you can see that the main method is of value void, which means it's really not going to return anything. We can do something similar with our add method by changing it to void instead of int. And so, because it's not returning anything, we get a couple of errors. First, we cannot pass a void value to the greatline method, so let's just delete the greatline method call and leave the call to the add method like this. And also, because, well, we can't return anything, we cannot call the return function. What we can do is define a variable in here. Because this is an addition between integer numbers, our variable has to be int as well. To define a variable, then, all we have to do is write the type of the variable and then the name. In this case, the name can be result, and then assign it to something. In this case, the addition of the two values that we are receiving inside of the method. So this is how a variable is defined and assign a value. So in this line, we are doing two things. First, we are defining the variable, and then we are assigning a value to it. This can even be split into two lines. First, the definition, ending with a semicolon, and then assigning a value to it. In this case, because the result already exists, we can access it just like this. So we have first the definition of the variable, and then we're sending a value to it. And finally, because we already have this value, we can do console.writeLine and write the result. We're starting to use the variable. And if we run this, we're going to see that the result is the exact same one that we saw before, except that this time we're calling the writeLine directly from the add method instead of from the main method. Now, variables have their own scope, meaning that they only exist within the block of code in which they are defined. For example, if I wanted to use that result variable over in the main method, well, it just doesn't exist because it is not defined inside of this scope. I could define another variable that is called the same way because it doesn't exist in this context, so I can define another one. But really, this result variable does not exist over in the main method. It only exists inside of the add method. Variables can also get their values from what a method returns. Let's modify the definition of our add method so it is again an integer. It is going to return the result, and so the add method has the same functionality that it had before. But now let's define a new variable that is going to be assigned to whatever this method returns. What we can do is define an integer in here that can also be called result, and then right below assign result to whatever the add method is going to return. But there is another way in which we can define variables, and that is to use the var keyword. So if I use the var keyword, I do not need to establish the type of the variable that is going to be created. It is going to be implied because we are already assigning a value to it. So if in the same line of code we are defining and then assigning a value to a variable, we can actually define it as var. And var is not going to be the type of the variable, it's just going to say that this variable is going to get its type from the value that it is receiving. If we want to access the variable, notice that it is still an integer. We just define it quickly as var without the need of explicitly establishing its type. We briefly mentioned something about scope and how a variable exists only within the block of code into which it is defined. This means that this block of code also has its own scope. So I could define a couple of integer values inside of the program class that will exist throughout this entire scope.